Maria Kowalski's fingers moved like lightning across the fabric, her needle catching the dim candlelight in her small Warsaw apartment. To anyone watching through the cracked window, she appeared to be just another seamstress trying to make ends meet during the harsh winter of 1943. The German officers who occasionally passed by her shop never gave her a second glance. She was 42 years old, with graying hair always pulled back in a simple bun, wearing the same worn brown dress day after day. She looked exactly like what they expected from a Polish woman during wartime, defeated, struggling, invisible. But Maria's needle wasn't just mending torn clothing. Hidden within the intricate stitches of seemingly ordinary garments, she was weaving coded messages that would find their way to the Polish resistance fighters hiding in the forests outside the city. Each pattern told a story that could save lives or expose Nazi movements. The floral design on Mrs. Nowak's dress sleeve contained the location of a German ammunition depot. The geometric border on young Pavel's jacket hem revealed the patrol schedule for the South District. Every thread was a whisper of rebellion in a language only the resistance understood. The arrangement had begun by accident 18 months earlier. Maria had been repairing a coat for Jan Kowalczyk, a man she knew only as a customer who always paid in exact change and never made small talk. When she handed him the finished coat, she noticed his hands shaking as he examined her work. The intricate pattern she had embroidered to cover a large tear had inadvertently matched a code the resistance used to identify safe houses. Jan stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for any sign that she understood what she had created. "Do you know what this means?" he had whispered, pointing to the delicate stitching. Maria's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "I just fixed the tear as best I could." That night, Jan returned after curfew with 3 other men. They explained who they were and what they were fighting for. They told her about the code and asked if she would be willing to help. Maria thought of her younger brother who had disappeared 6 months earlier, taken by the Gestapo for reasons no one ever explained. She thought of the children in her neighborhood who had grown thin and quiet, their laughter stolen by fear. She looked at these brave men risking their lives to visit her, and her answer came without hesitation. "Tell me what you need." The system they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Resistance members would bring their torn clothing to Maria's shop during regular business hours, looking like ordinary customers. Hidden in the pockets or sewn into the lining, they would leave small pieces of paper with information they needed to communicate: German troop movements, supply schedules, names of collaborators, locations of hidden weapons. Maria would repair the clothing and embed the information into decorative stitching patterns that matched their established code. When the garments were picked up, the information went with them, traveling invisibly through Nazi checkpoints and patrols. The Gestapo never suspected the quiet seamstress. Officer Klaus Weber had even brought his wife's evening dress to Maria for alterations before a Nazi social function. As Maria pinned the hem, she listened carefully to Frau Weber's gossip about which high-ranking officials would be attending and where the event was being held. That information, later stitched into the collar of a resistance fighter's shirt, helped the underground plan their most successful sabotage operation of the winter. But Maria's most dangerous work wasn't the coded clothing. 3 times a week, she would put on her oldest coat and a tattered scarf, carrying a worn cloth bag filled with what appeared to be fabric scraps and old buttons. She would walk through the city, stopping at various shops and markets, playing the role of a woman trying to trade small items for food. The German soldiers saw exactly what they expected to see: another desperate Polish civilian, barely worth noticing. What they didn't see was that Maria was conducting surveillance that would make trained spies envious. Her routes took her past key military installations, government buildings, and transportation hubs. She had taught herself to count vehicles, memorize guard rotations, and identify different types of equipment. Her excellent memory, sharpened by years of remembering complex sewing patterns and measurements, now served to catalog enemy positions and movements with remarkable accuracy. In her apartment each evening, Maria would carefully document everything she had observed. She used a system of her own creation, disguising military intelligence as sewing notes. Need 14 yards blue fabric, heavy weave, delivery Tuesday morning might actually mean 14 tanks observed, heavy armor, moving east Tuesday dawn. Her notebook, which sat openly on her kitchen table, looked like nothing more than a seamstress keeping track of orders and supplies. The closest call had come 3 weeks earlier. Hauptmann Friedrich Kessler, known for his methodical investigations and cold efficiency, had decided to conduct random searches of businesses in Maria's district. When he entered her shop with 2 subordinates, Maria was genuinely working on a customer's dress, her hand steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. Kessler examined her workspace with calculating eyes, looking for anything out of place. He picked up several garments, studying the stitching patterns closely. Maria's heart nearly stopped when he held up a jacket containing information about German supply routes. The coded message worked into what appeared to be a decorative vine pattern along the collar. "Interesting needlework," he had said, his voice giving away nothing. "Thank you, sir. My grandmother taught me. She always said that even in hard times, people deserve something beautiful." Maria's voice remained calm, though sweat trickled down her spine. Kessler continued his inspection, opening drawers and examining her supplies. He found her notebook and flipped through pages of what looked like mundane business records. His finger paused on an entry that read, "Mrs. Kowalski needs new black thread, heavy cotton, order 40 spools." In reality, this noted that 40 German soldiers had been reassigned to the eastern checkpoint. But, to Kessler, it simply looked like a supply order. After 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours, Kessler returned the notebook to the table. "Keep your receipt books organized, Frau Kowalski. Good record-keeping is important for all citizens of the Reich." "Of course, Hauptmann. Thank you for the reminder." As soon as they left, Maria had to sit down, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. But there was no time to rest. That evening's delivery included crucial information about a planned German raid on a resistance-safe house. Lives depended on her maintaining her routine. The mental toll of living this double life was enormous. Maria slept only a few hours each night, jolting awake at every sound. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and her hair had turned almost completely gray. But she also felt more alive than she ever had. For the first time in her life, Maria Kowalski was making a difference that mattered. Her neighbors saw a woman growing old before her time, worn down by the hardships of war. They whispered that poor Maria was becoming strange, talking to herself while she worked and taking long walks alone despite the danger. They felt sorry for the spinster seamstress who seemed to have no family or close friends. They had no idea that Maria was part of a network that spanned half of occupied Europe. The intelligence she gathered was passed through resistance channels to the Polish government in exile in London, and from there to Allied commanders planning operations across multiple fronts. The seemingly random observations of a Warsaw seamstress were being discussed in rooms where the fate of nations was decided. But Maria's greatest contribution was yet to come. In late February 1943, while conducting her usual surveillance route, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. German engineers were surveying the old railway bridge that crossed the Vistula River, taking measurements and making detailed drawings. More disturbing were the trucks filled with what appeared to be demolition equipment, parked discreetly in a warehouse district near the bridge. Over the next several days, Maria modified her walking routes to observe the bridge area more carefully. She counted personnel, noted the arrival of specialized equipment, and watched as German sappers examined the bridge's support structures. The pattern became clear: they were planning to destroy the bridge. This wasn't just about stopping resistance movements from using the crossing. Maria's contacts had told her that Allied forces were planning a major operation that would require crossing the Vistula at multiple points. If the Germans destroyed this bridge, one of only 3 viable crossing points in the region, it could compromise the entire operation and cost thousands of Allied lives. The information was too important to trust to their usual methods. Maria needed to get this intelligence to London as quickly as possible, but the regular resistance communication channels would take weeks. She needed a more direct route, and she knew exactly who to contact. 3 months earlier, Maria had been introduced to a resistance fighter known only as Raven. Unlike the local fighters she usually worked with, Raven had direct connections to Allied intelligence networks. He was dangerous to contact. The Germans had placed a substantial bounty on his head, but he could get urgent information to London in a matter of days rather than weeks. Maria spent 2 sleepless nights planning how to reach Raven safely. The meeting would require her to travel across the city to a district she rarely visited, increasing her chances of being stopped and questioned. She would have to abandon her usual careful routine and take risks that went against everything the resistance had taught her about staying safe. But, as she looked out her window at the bridge in the distance, Maria knew she had no choice. The war was reaching a crucial turning point, and she held information that could influence its outcome. The quiet seamstress who had been written off as insignificant was about to play the most important role of her life. Maria began preparing for what she knew might be her final mission. She carefully documented everything she had observed about the bridge, encoding the information using multiple methods in case one was discovered. She arranged her apartment so that if she didn't return, her regular resistance contacts would find the intelligence and know what had happened to her. On the morning of March 1, 1943, Maria Kowalski put on her best dress, a simple blue wool outfit she had been saving for a special occasion. She braided her gray hair carefully and pinned it up in a style that made her look dignified rather than defeated. For once, she didn't want to be invisible. As she prepared to leave for what might be her last day of freedom, Maria caught her reflection in the small mirror by her door. The woman looking back at her wasn't the scared seamstress who had accidentally stumbled into resistance work. This was someone who had found her purpose in the darkest of times, someone who refused to let evil triumph without a fight. Maria picked up her sewing basket, now containing the most important intelligence she had ever gathered, and stepped into the cold Warsaw morning. The bridge loomed in the distance, and, somewhere across the city, Raven was waiting for information that could change the course of the war. The woman they had all written off was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful weapons come in the most unexpected packages. The tram ride across Warsaw felt like the longest journey of Maria's life. She sat in the back section reserved for Polish civilians, her sewing basket clutched tightly on her lap, watching the familiar streets give way to unfamiliar neighborhoods. Each German checkpoint they passed sent waves of anxiety through her chest, but the soldiers barely glanced at the middle-aged woman with tired eyes and work-worn hands. They saw exactly what Maria wanted them to see, someone so ordinary she was practically invisible. The meeting location was a bombed-out church in the Praga district, where Raven had left word through their mutual contact that he would be waiting. Maria had never been to this part of the city before, and the destruction here was far worse than in her own neighborhood. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble, with only the skeletal remains of buildings reaching toward the gray sky like broken teeth. The few people she saw moved quickly with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with strangers. Finding the church proved more difficult than expected. The street signs had been destroyed in the bombing, and the landscape of debris made navigation nearly impossible. Maria wandered for almost an hour, her heart rate climbing with each passing minute. The longer she stayed in this unfamiliar area, the greater her chances of being stopped and questioned. A woman alone in this district would attract attention she couldn't afford. Finally, she spotted the distinctive broken spire that matched the description she'd been given. The Church of St. Bartholomew had once been a beautiful Gothic structure, but now only 3 walls remained standing. The interior was open to the sky, filled with chunks of stone and twisted metal. Weeds had begun growing through cracks in the foundation, nature slowly reclaiming what war had destroyed. Maria entered through what had once been the main doors, now just an opening in a crumbling wall. The silence was profound, no city noise penetrated this pocket of destruction. She made her way carefully through the debris, looking for any sign of human presence. According to the instructions, Raven would be waiting near what remained of the altar. "You're late." The voice came from behind a fallen pillar, calm but with an edge of tension. Maria turned to see a man emerging from the shadows. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings. His clothes were worn but well-maintained, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to danger. This was Raven. "I had trouble finding the location," Maria replied, using the agreed-upon phrase to identify herself. Raven studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Jan Kowalczyk speaks highly of your work. He says you see things others miss. I observe what's in front of me. Nothing more. Today, that might be enough to change history." Raven stepped closer, his expression serious. "Jan mentioned you have urgent information about German military preparations. Maria reached into her sewing basket and withdrew what appeared to be an ordinary piece of embroidered cloth. To untrained eyes, it looked like a decorative panel intended for a dress or tablecloth. The delicate stitching showed a landscape scene with trees, a bridge, and small buildings arranged in what seemed like an artistic pattern. "This contains everything I've observed about the Vistula Bridge," Maria explained, pointing to different sections of the embroidery. "The tree pattern here represents the demolition equipment I've seen. The number of branches corresponds to the amount of explosives being positioned. The bridge in the center shows the structural points they're focusing on." Raven examined the cloth with growing amazement. "This is incredibly detailed. How long did this take you to create?" 3 days of almost constant work. "But I've been observing the site for 2 weeks." Maria pointed to small details in the stitching. "The buildings represent the personnel I've counted. Different roof styles indicate different types of specialists, engineers, sappers, regular infantry. The flowers along the border show the timeline of their activities." As Maria explained her encoding system, Raven realized he was looking at intelligence gathering of extraordinary sophistication. This seamstress had managed to document German preparations with a level of detail that professional spies would envy. More importantly, she had done it while remaining completely invisible to enemy surveillance. "The timeline suggests they plan to destroy the bridge within the next 10 days, Maria continued. "I've seen them testing detonators and positioning charges. They're being very careful to make their activities look like routine maintenance, but the pattern is clear." Raven folded the embroidered cloth carefully and placed it inside his jacket. "This information needs to reach London immediately. If what you're saying is accurate, it could affect operations involving thousands of Allied soldiers." "It's accurate," Maria said quietly. "I stake my life on that. You already have, just by being here." Raven looked around the ruined church, checking for any signs they had been followed. The journey across the city was dangerous enough, but getting this intelligence to the right people will be even more perilous. Maria had expected this. She knew that passing information to Raven was only the first step in a complex chain that would ultimately reach Allied command. Each link in that chain represented people risking their lives to ensure the intelligence arrived safely. "There's something else," Maria said, reaching back into her sewing basket. She withdrew a small notebook bound in worn leather. "I've been keeping detailed records of German activities throughout the city. Patrol patterns, supply schedules, personnel changes, new installations. Most of it might seem routine, but, taken together, it shows their overall strategy." Raven accepted the notebook with reverence. As he flipped through the pages, he saw what amounted to a comprehensive intelligence assessment of German operations in Warsaw. The information was disguised as sewing notes and customer records, but the underlying military significance was extraordinary. "How long have you been gathering this?" he asked. 18 months. Since I began working with the resistance. This is the work of a professional intelligence officer. How did a seamstress learn to do this?" Maria smiled sadly. "I had a good teacher. My brother was a mathematics professor before the war. He used to say that patterns are everywhere if you know how to look for them. The Germans have patterns too, they just don't realize that someone like me would notice them." The mention of her brother brought back the familiar ache of loss. Maria still didn't know what had happened to him after the Gestapo took him away. She had channeled her grief into this work, using her pain as fuel for her resistance activities. "Your brother would be proud," Raven said gently, recognizing the emotion in her voice. "He would tell me I'm being reckless." Maria managed a small smile. "He always said I was too stubborn for my own good." Raven secured the notebook alongside the embroidered intelligence. "I have to ask, are you prepared for what might happen next? Once this information reaches Allied command, the Germans will know someone is watching their bridge operation. They'll investigate. They'll suspect local informants." Maria had considered this possibility during her sleepless nights of planning. "I understand the risks. But, if I do nothing, and Allied soldiers die because of information I could have provided, how could I live with that?" There might be a way to minimize the danger to you, Raven said thoughtfully. We could arrange for you to disappear from Warsaw before the intelligence is acted upon. New identity papers, a place in the countryside where the Germans won't look for you. The offer was tempting. Maria was tired of living in constant fear, tired of watching every word and gesture, tired of pretending to be someone she wasn't. The chance to escape Warsaw and find safety in some remote village held enormous appeal. But Maria shook her head. My work isn't finished here. There are too many people depending on the network we've built. If I disappear suddenly, it might compromise others. Raven studied her with new respect. You realize that staying increases your chances of being discovered exponentially. I realize that running away would mean abandoning everything I've worked to build. The Germans want us to be afraid. They want us to hide and give up. Every time we choose courage over safety, we win a small victory against them. The conviction in Maria's voice reminded Raven why the Polish resistance had been so effective despite overwhelming odds. It wasn't just about military tactics or intelligence gathering, it was about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when everything they valued was threatened. There's one more thing you should know, Raven said. The bridge operation you've discovered isn't just about stopping resistance activities. Allied intelligence believes the Germans are preparing for a strategic withdrawal from this region. Destroying the bridges would slow any Allied advance while they reposition their forces. This information put Maria's intelligence in an even larger context. She wasn't just helping to save individual lives, she was contributing to strategic decisions that could affect the entire course of the war in Eastern Europe. Then, we can't let them succeed, Maria said simply. Raven made his final preparations to leave, checking his weapons and ensuring the intelligence was securely hidden. How do we contact you if we need additional information or confirmation? You don't. After today, I return to my normal routine and, wait. If you need me, Jan Kowalczyk knows how to reach me safely. And, if the Germans come looking? Maria's expression hardened. Then, I'll deal with that when it happens. But, I won't make it easy for them. As they prepared to part ways, Raven extended his hand. What you've done today will be remembered. Somewhere in London, generals will make decisions based on your observations. Somewhere in the field, Allied soldiers will live because you had the courage to gather this intelligence. Maria shook his hand, feeling the calluses of a man who knew hard work and harder choices. I hope it's enough. It will be more than enough. Raven disappeared into the rubble of the church as quietly as he had appeared. Maria waited several minutes before beginning her own journey back across the city. The return trip felt different, lighter somehow, despite the increased danger she now faced. She had done everything possible to ensure the intelligence would reach the right people. The rest was out of her hands. Back on the tram, Maria noticed things she had missed during the morning journey. German soldiers looked tired and stressed rather than confident. Supply convoys seemed smaller than in previous weeks. Civilian morale appeared lower than ever, but there were also subtle signs of defiance, the graffiti that hadn't been there before, people meeting each other's eyes instead of looking away, small acts of kindness that reminded everyone they were still human. The war was changing, and people could sense it even if they couldn't articulate what was different. Maria's intelligence was just one piece in a vast puzzle, but it was a crucial piece. The woman they had written off as insignificant had just delivered information that would ripple through Allied command structures and potentially alter the timing and strategy of major military operations. When Maria finally reached her own neighborhood, she felt as though she had returned from a journey to another world. Her small apartment looked exactly as she had left it, but everything felt different. She had crossed a line today, not just geographically, but personally. She was no longer simply helping the local resistance with coded messages and routine surveillance. She had become a key intelligence asset in a much larger war. That evening, as Maria resumed her normal routine of mending clothes and updating her disguised records, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Whatever happened next, she had done her duty. The quiet seamstress had delivered intelligence that could help turn the tide of war. Now she could only wait and hope that her courage would be enough to see her through whatever consequences might follow. In the smoke-filled rooms where generals made their war plans, her name never appeared on any document. When historians wrote about the turning points of World War II, they forgot to mention the woman who carried secrets across enemy lines while everyone believed she was just another refugee. They wrote her off as insignificant, a nobody who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Maria Kowalski held the key to victory in her weathered hands, and she was about to prove that the most dangerous weapon in any war isn't always the one that makes the most noise. What they didn't know was that this quiet seamstress from Warsaw had been playing a deadly game of chess with the Nazi regime for 3 years. While they dismissed her as harmless, she had already saved hundreds of lives and was about to deliver intelligence that would change the course of history. This is her story, the story they tried to erase, the woman they underestimated, and the moment when everything hung in the balance of one person's courage. 7 days after her meeting with Raven, Maria's world began to unravel with terrifying speed. She was mending a customer's coat when she heard the familiar sound of military vehicles stopping outside her building. But, this time, instead of passing by, the engines went silent. Through her small window, Maria could see German soldiers positioning themselves around the building's entrances. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the methodical precision of a planned raid. The intelligence had reached its destination. Somewhere in London, Allied commanders had acted on her information about the bridge demolition. The Germans had discovered their plans were compromised, and now they were hunting for the source of the leak. Maria had always known this moment might come, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different things. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached her door. Moving with practiced efficiency, Maria began destroying evidence that could compromise other resistance members. Her coated notebook went into the small fireplace, along with several pieces of embroidered cloth containing intelligence she hadn't yet passed along. The acrid smoke filled her apartment as 18 months of meticulous work turned to ash. The pounding on her door came just as she finished burning the last compromising document. "Open immediately. Gestapo." Maria smoothed her dress, checked her reflection in the small mirror, and opened the door with the expression of confused innocence she had practiced countless times. "Good evening, officers. How may I help you?" Hauptmann Kessler stood in her doorway, flanked by 4 armed soldiers. His cold eyes swept over her apartment, taking in every detail. "Frau Kowalski, you will come with us for questioning." "Questioning? But I've done nothing wrong. I'm just a seamstress." "That remains to be determined." Kessler stepped into the apartment, his subordinates following. "Search everything. Leave no hiding place unchecked." Maria watched in apparent bewilderment as the soldiers systematically destroyed her modest home. They ripped open mattresses, emptied drawers, and examined every piece of fabric in her workspace. One soldier held up a dress she had been embroidering with an intricate floral pattern. "What does this design represent?" Kessler demanded. "Roses and lilies, Mrs. Nowak requested something cheerful for her daughter's wedding." Maria's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. The pattern actually contained information about German supply routes, but the coded elements were so subtle that only trained resistance members would recognize them. Kessler studied the embroidery for several long minutes, clearly suspicious but unable to identify anything overtly incriminating. He had Maria's work investigated before, after the failed sabotage operation that had resulted from intelligence traced back to this district. But every expert they consulted confirmed that her stitching patterns appeared to be purely decorative. "You leave this building frequently," Kessler observed, consulting notes from his surveillance reports. "Where do you go?" "To buy supplies. To deliver finished work to customers. Sometimes to the market for food." Maria clasped her hands together to hide their slight trembling. "The same places any seamstress would go. Our records show you walking past the railway bridge area several times in recent weeks." "Why?" This was the question Maria had been dreading. Her surveillance of the bridge had been more frequent than her usual routine would justify. "There's a fabric shop on Podwale Street that sometimes has good thread at reasonable prices. The bridge route is the shortest way there." One of the soldiers emerged from the kitchen area holding the charred remains from her fireplace. Hauptmann, someone has been burning papers recently. Kessler examined the ashes, his expression darkening. What were you burning, Frau Kowalski? Old receipts and customer notes. I was cleaning out my records to make room for new business papers. Maria gestured toward her sewing area. I keep very detailed records, as you suggested during your last visit. Sometimes I need to dispose of outdated information. It was a plausible explanation, and Kessler had indeed advised her to maintain good records. But the timing was suspicious. He signaled to his men, and they began a second, more thorough search. This time they examined individual threads, looked for hidden compartments, and tested every surface for concealed writing. During the search, Maria noticed something that made her stomach lurch. One of the soldiers was carrying a cloth bag that looked familiar. As he turned toward the light, she could see embroidered fabric visible through the opening. It was the intelligence she had passed to Raven, the detailed documentation of German bridge preparations that should have been safely in Allied hands by now. The implications were catastrophic. If the Germans had recovered her intelligence before it reached London, not only had her mission failed, but the enemy now knew exactly how much the resistance knew about their bridge operation. They would accelerate their demolition timeline and implement additional security measures that would make future intelligence gathering nearly impossible. We found this hidden in a resistance safe house 2 days ago, Kessler said, producing the embroidered cloth and watching Maria's face carefully for any reaction. The stitching pattern matches work we've seen from this district. Very distinctive technique. Maria studied the fabric with apparent confusion. It's beautiful work. But I don't recognize the pattern. Many seamstresses in Warsaw use similar techniques. Indeed. But few have your particular skill with coated embroidery. Kessler's voice carried the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. The game was over. Somehow, the Germans had identified her coding system and traced her intelligence back to its source. Maria felt a strange sense of relief mixed with terror. After 18 months of constant vigilance and fear, she no longer had to maintain her careful masquerade. But she also knew that what came next would test her courage in ways she had never imagined. I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean by coded embroidery, Maria said, making one last attempt to maintain her cover. I simply try to make beautiful patterns that please my customers. Kessler smiled coldly. Your customers include some very interesting people, Frau Kowalski. Raven, for instance. We know about your meeting at the Church of St. Bartholomew. Maria's heart sank. If they knew about Raven, the entire network was compromised. How many people would suffer because of her actions? How many lives would be lost because she had tried to be a hero? I don't know anyone called Raven. You must be mistaken. Perhaps you'll remember more clearly after spending some time in our facilities. Kessler nodded to his men. Take her. As the soldiers moved to arrest her, Maria made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. Instead of submitting passively, she grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, a large pair of fabric scissors from her workbench, and pressed the point against her own throat. Stay back, she commanded, her voice suddenly strong and clear. I have information you need, but I'll die before I let you torture it out of me. The soldiers froze, uncertain how to handle a middle-aged seamstress who had just transformed into a defiant enemy agent. Kessler raised his hand to prevent them from advancing. That would be foolish, Frau Kowalski. We can offer you better treatment if you cooperate voluntarily. I've seen how the Gestapo treats people who cooperate. My cooperation ends with my death, one way or another. Maria's hand remained steady despite her fear. But I might be willing to trade information for guarantees about other people's safety. It was a desperate gambit, but Maria knew she held one crucial advantage. The Germans needed to understand the full extent of resistance intelligence operations in order to counter them effectively. A dead informant would tell them nothing. What kind of guarantees? Kessler asked, his tone suggesting he was willing to negotiate. I want assurance that Jan Kowalczyk and his family will not be harmed. They know nothing about intelligence operations. He simply brought me clothes to mend. And, in exchange? I'll tell you everything about my activities. Every method I used, every person I observed, every piece of information I gathered. Maria took a deep breath. But, only after you demonstrate that the Kowalczyk family is safe. Kessler considered the offer. Jan Kowalczyk was already on their list of suspected resistance sympathizers, but they had no solid evidence against him. Trading his safety for comprehensive intelligence about resistance operations was actually a favorable exchange from the German perspective. Agreed. But, you will come with us now, and you will begin talking immediately. Maria slowly lowered the scissors. I keep my word, Hauptmann. I expect you to keep yours. As the soldiers prepared to take her away, Maria looked around her small apartment one final time. The destroyed furniture and scattered fabric told the story of a life dedicated to quiet resistance against overwhelming evil. She had been written off as insignificant, dismissed as harmless, ignored as irrelevant. But, in these humble rooms, surrounded by the tools of her trade, she had fought a war that mattered. The interrogation that followed would be brutal, but Maria had already achieved her most important victory. While the Germans had captured her intelligence about the bridge operation, they had acted too late to prevent Allied commanders from using the information. The bridge demolition had been delayed by military action based on her observations, buying crucial time for Allied operations in the region. More importantly, the very fact that the Germans had felt compelled to conduct such an extensive investigation proved how effective her intelligence gathering had been. They wouldn't be hunting so desperately for the source of their intelligence leaks if those leaks hadn't been causing serious damage to their operations. As the Gestapo vehicle drove through the dark streets of Warsaw, Maria reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She had started as an accidental resistance member, stumbling into coded embroidery through pure chance. But, she had chosen to become something more, a dedicated intelligence operative who had helped turn the tide of war through careful observation and extraordinary courage. The woman they wrote off had indeed brought back the war's turning point. Not through dramatic battles or heroic speeches, but through the quiet accumulation of vital information gathered by someone invisible enough to move freely through enemy territory. Maria Kowalski had proven that in wartime, the most powerful weapons often come in the most unexpected packages. Her story would not appear in official histories. Her name would not be engraved on monuments. But, in the secret files of Allied intelligence agencies, and in the memories of resistance fighters who survived the war, Maria's contribution would be remembered as a crucial element in the eventual liberation of Poland. The seamstress had written her own chapter in history, using threads of courage to weave together intelligence that helped free her nation. They had written her off as insignificant, but she had proven that significance comes not from recognition, but from the willingness to risk everything for what matters most. In the months that followed, other resistance members would learn of Maria's fate and draw inspiration from her example. They would understand that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to accept defeat. The quiet seamstress had shown them that even in the darkest times, hope could be maintained through small acts of defiance that accumulated into something powerful enough to change the course of history. Maria Kowalski had kept her promise to herself and her country. She had fought the war in her own way, with her own weapons, and had made a difference that rippled far beyond her small apartment in Warsaw. The woman they underestimated had helped deliver the victory they all desperately needed.